Humanity did not exist in our galaxy. They had been born in another, and, as their histories say, met many new and wondrous species. As time had passed for them, they had grown in power, knowledge and wisdom, but in many dark ways as well. But unlike some species, they had strived to be better than their inner darkness would have them be. There were times, of course, where they needed to unleash that darkness, when war threatened their very way of life, when a species simply would not take no for an answer. The darkness was there, waiting to be set free. In the end, only a few select species would survive the galactic scale war that was thrust upon them. A war which left countless systems as little more than dust. Humanity, so disgusted with their actions, decided to turn isolationist for a time, as some form of repentance for their sins against the universe. Sins born of a desire to survive and once again thrive. Nobody could blame them for the steps they'd taken to ensure their survival, as they were not the aggressors of that terrible conflict. But they were the victors, along with several of their allies. At the beginning of this war, they stood proudly with 49 other species who were fiercely accepting and loyal to the ancient oaths they'd made with humanity. At the end, only 5, including themselves, had survived, the others exterminated. Such was their grief that many simply could not go on, slipping off to the place beyond in silence. But at the time, our galaxy knew none of this. We lived in blissful ignorance of their suffering. One day we would know, and it is of this day I shall recount for the record. It was as our homeworlds burned, the fleets of the Crisian dynasty blotting out our sun, while our brave soldiers held them back on the ground. We are the Confederacy, an alliance of 6 species who all evolve within the same solar system. Our history is not important at this moment. What is important is how we first met humanity. The Crisians were conducting 6 separate planetary invasions at the same time. Some of us were having a better job of repelling their ground troops than others, especially the aquatic Akrelo, whose world was entirely ocean. The Crisians have an extreme phobia of large bodies of water, so the Akrelo made good use of their advantage. The rest of us were being pounded, sometimes from orbit if the target was eligible for such a strike. I remember standing in the command center, which had been hastily erected within our Parliament building. The walls shook as another artillery blast rocked the building, dust falling upon the hollow table I stood at. With a feathered hand I brushed the dust away, watching as the hollow flickered and updated as quickly as it could, showing me that the enemy had gained yet more ground and were beginning to properly encircle the building. Soon they would be inside, and then it would be over. We would be slaves at best, a memory at worst. "My lord, Sky Station Rune is reporting a new contact on the edge of the system," a technician chirped, and my crest flattened a bit more. "Can you identify it? Is it more Crisians?" I asked, and the technician shook their head. "Negative, sir. Rune can't determine who it belongs to. They say that something about it is interfering with their scans. However, they can say it doesn't seem to be all that big, about cruiser size at best. It's skirting around the edge of the system. They're not sure if it's detected us or the Crisians, but it looks to be avoiding the inner system entirely." "Hail them. Tell them to jump away immediately. I will not allow the unknown innocents to be lost as well," I say, the tech nodding and turning back to their console. I hope they are a species we've met before, one that'll understand us and know that it is the best thing to simply leave. What help could they provide? Another explosion, and I closed my eyes, praying that the end would be swift. The ship drifted through the void, sleek, white, and more a piece of art than the warship it really was. Though it had not seen war in a long, long time. Unarmed scout ships were a thing of the past, and especially out here it was best to be prepared. Which was why the Titania was fully armed and stocked with the best weapons for its tonnage. Its crews worked quietly, running data again and again to ensure what they received was accurate. In the mess halls, the crew were jovial and rambunctious, as was the norm. Soldiers trained and sparred. It was just another day. Another long, boring day. Many wished something would happen. Anything. even if it was just a small ship fire or whatever. Hell, they would have settled for hunting rats if there were any. On the bridge, a grizzled captain sat, the thumb of his right hand idly rubbing a now rather faded incision scar upon his left arm, where a special implant had been introduced long ago. He wasn't really paying attention, running on autopilot as some would say, when suddenly the comms chirped and everyone perked up. "Sir, we've been hailed," the ensign at comms said, and the captain felt his heart quicken just a little bit. "Run it through the translator, then we'll see if there's a need to reply," he said, the ensign nodding and doing as ordered. "Sir, the hail is coming from the fourth planet in the system. It seems to be a warning of some sort. Something about, Chrysian? They say there is great danger here, and we should flee while we can," the ensign spoke, and yet again the captain was thankful that their translator software was so top-notch. It barely needed access to any sort of lexicon and could, with the passive sensors that always ran, construct entire translation libraries from the background signals of a species. In essence, it listened to a species from 1,000 or 100 years ago, and built off what it heard. It wasn't perfect, but it worked so well that it was standard issue for every ship in the fleets. Of course, once they got access to a lexicon, things were refined, but they were just here to scout and see how things were in this galaxy, not make first contact. The message, however, had the captain feeling uneasy. "Scan the inner system. Perhaps we can make better sense of the message once we have." An officer nodded, conducting some not-so-subtle scans. All on the bridge heard their sharp intake of breath. "There appears to be an invasion happening. I'm reading 6 planets under heavy orbital assault and ground invasion. The invading fleets have the advantage, sir," the sensor officer said, and all went quiet. 12 pairs of eyes turned to look at the captain, who was at war with his mission and orders, but also with his conscience. He knew there was no way a single ship could hope to defeat the invading forces, and for all he knew, these invaders could be on a just mission. But that didn't negate the fact that it was the invaded who had urged him and his ship to flee, and even if they were the bad guys of this conflict, that was a pretty considerate thing to do. At last, after a long and tense silence, he made up his mind. "Respond via text to the hail. Send this message only. Helm, lay in a course that'll bring us into orbit around the fourth planet. XO, go wake the angels." He spoke clearly, and with that experience and confidence he'd always shown, typing out the message he wished to send, the crew moving to execute his will. And so the Titania began to turn, heading for the heart of the war-torn system. I stretched out a hand and took the pistol that was offered to me as the sounds of fighting grew louder. A flank had fallen already. The Chrysian were inside the building, and while I would be staying in the command center to coordinate for as long as I could, I would not allow myself to die without a weapon in my hand. "Sir, we've received a response from the unknown ship," the tech announced, and before I even spoke they'd already sent it my way. I opened it and stared down at the simple text response, with an incredulous look on my face. "We're on our way. Help is coming. You'll know it when you see it. Please don't shoot us." Were these people insane? What could they hope to do against the Chrysian Armada? Setting the weapon on the table, I pointed at the tech, the motion itself causing an alert to activate on his eyepiece. "I want a sensor on that ship at all times. Keep telling them to break off their run till they decide to cut you off. Inform our remaining forces we may have company soon of unknown origin and disposition. Unless fired upon by these unknowns, do not fire on them. Focus on the Chrysians at all costs," I squawked, and the tech jumped slightly, but did as I commanded. I was given a small window in which I could see the little blip that was this unknown ship, moving far faster than anything I'd ever seen. It swooped through the enemy fleets before they'd even had a chance to react, and dipped slightly into our atmosphere, where they slowed just a little bit and then broke off, heading for the other besieged planets in the system. I watched as several Chrysian ships moved to engage it. Their shots were registered as hitting the unknown vessel, but then the Chrysian ships were removed from play. All of a sudden, the table chimed an alert. "Unknown contacts entering the atmosphere. Projected landing zone around the Parliament building." I looked at the blips that had suddenly appeared and counted only 6. 6 did not seem like enough to me, but perhaps it was all they could spare for us. The question that quickly plagued me then was what exactly they had just dropped into our atmosphere. Bombs? Ships? Maybe a bit of both. I didn't know, but I hoped that it would be enough to save us. Specialist Skook peeked bravely over the broken concrete barrier he was using as cover, ducking down quickly as a laser grazed his plumage and nearly ignited it. Raising his rifle, he blind-fired into the great unknown and heard a pained cry from the Corisian savage that had taken a shot at him. Or maybe it was one of their buddies. Either way, he'd hit something that was alive, and that counted as a good thing. "Eyes up! Reinforcements inbound! Orbital insertion!" his CO shouted over the comms, and the question that was suddenly on his and everyone else's mind was just what reinforcements they could be getting, and why were they coming from orbit? Several booms shook the air and made him shiver. These were not the booms of artillery, but the sonic booms of something breaking the sound barrier. He looked up and saw 6 streaks of fire, 2 of which broke off and headed for elsewhere in the capital city. The last 4 spread out a bit, but were still headed practically right for him. Now, Specialist Skook was not an easily frightened person. Even earlier, when the invasion had begun, he'd been relatively calm. But seeing a fireball streak towards him from orbit had a distinct effect on him. As his eyes widened into abyss-like pools of darkness filled with the ever-growing sight of the fireball, he could not stop the scream of terror that erupted from his beak. He covered his head with his rifle and curled up into as tight a ball as his anatomy would allow when he was certain the impact was imminent. Yet it never came. Instead of the resounding boom of high-speed impact, there was a loud humming noise, and he could not stop himself from raising his head to see what made such a sound. Instead of death, he saw a most beautiful sight. A winged and rather slim biped made of metal. The wings a flare of energy, and his weapon of choice was a rather large spear. It was massive as well, at least 60 tetras, a feat for any humans reading this tale. And as he gazed upon it, a halo of burning golden light formed over its angular head. What he found strangest of all was that it almost looked like massive, almost primitive armour, complete with a flowing skirt with no front to it. He had no idea what those were called, only that they had once been popular amongst the warriors of his species, ages before he'd hatched. He stared at it, as did everyone else while the metal thing surveyed the battlefield. Then it shivered, a long and slender finger tapping a spot on his hip. 10 strange orbs dropped from a hidden compartment, and upon striking the ground they unfolded into what looked like some sort of 4-legged animal, and bounded up the steps of the Parliament building, heading inside. Then it spoke. "Friendlies identified and tagged. Beginning combat maneuvers." The voice that spoke was ethereal, haunting even. But as it finished, that haunting tone turned deeper with malice. The once bright and comforting light of his halo, and even the glowing golden eyes that burned within the helmet, turned a rich crimson. The beam surged forward, pods opening along his shoulders, and sending out 20 tiny missiles, which split into even more missiles that cleared out enemy light armor and some entrenched positions. But it was the ear-shattering shriek of an energy beam being projected from the tip of his spear that made us jolt out of our awe. It moved with such grace, such ease and fluidity, even as it never once touched the ground. It swooped, drifted and thrust with its spear, stabbing tanks with cold efficiency. In the distance, he saw an explosion rise into the air, and another winged form rose from it. This one was larger, not as slim as this one was. It was also painted black, the accent lines and halo glowing red. Instead of a spear, it carried a sword and shield, and behind it another rose to follow, another slim machine. It used a whip, cracking it and sending vehicles flying with one hand, the other occupied with a very large weapon, which spat metal death. It was like watching gods of war made into machine, exacting their will upon his world, but on his side, helping him and not the enemy. He watched as these angelic forms sent the Corisian running for their lives in fear. He thought them invincible, but he was wrong. Even as he and his comrades pushed forward to retake weapons emplacements they'd lost and bolster the lines, one was struck from the sky. It was brought down by a shot from a cruiser in low orbit, and that seemed to be about the only thing that could do it. It was the white, painted machine angel that was felled, the shot blasting through the shimmering energy shields it possessed and tearing the chest open. A pain scream that was far too organic for a machine to replicate erupted from it. Its spear rose and pointed towards the heavens, another scream of energy, and it brought down its killer. For the first time since the battle began, the angel touched the ground, falling to one knee and dropping the spear. Scoot didn't know what he was doing as he broke cover and formation to rush out towards it. The angel's shields returned, but it could not move itself. It had not the strength to do so. Already, the Corisian were advancing on it, eager for blood. He would not let them have it. The angel shifted their arm, a low groan leaving it as it provided him with physical cover. The shields flickered, then went down, and soon he was fighting for his life again. But he would not do so alone. Those who had seen him abandon the lines had felt compelled to follow him, and they took up positions on either side, holding the enemy back. "Not one more step back, brothers!" he yelled, a resounding cry rising from their throats. They knew they would not survive. Within the Parliament building, the fighting was growing more and more brutal. The Corisian hordes were pushing aggressively, but the Ocarello were holding the line stubbornly. That is till something introduced itself. A wall exploded, and a gleaming metal animal burst through it, latching onto a Corisian trooper and sinking large metal fangs into flesh. Claws tore chunks from the trooper, cannons appearing on the back of the animal and firing down the hallway with a terrible sound that drowned out all else. From the breach came two more of these strange machines, and they leapt up onto the walls. Their claws dug into the stone, and they bounded forward as though they were running on flat ground, defying the laws of gravity as they made an aggressive push on the Corisian forces. The defensive forces stood in shock, unable to think beyond the moment. The first of the machines dropped the limp and quite shredded Corisian trooper, turning to face the defenders. Naturally, the gaze of this machine prompted some to raise their rifles, as the machine opened its mouth. "Do not fear, we are here to help. Tend to your wounded. We shall take care of the trespassers," it said, its voice quite monotone and synthetic. Without another word, it turned away and bounded after its comrades, leaving the Equerlo troops dumbfounded for a time. Quickly, though, they did as it had suggested, and began tending to the wounded. Many voiced their wonder at the origins of such a machine creature, but they would not get an answer just yet. The Titania shook with another hit that splashed across her shields. She was taking more and more fire. The shields would have been squealing audibly had they been in Atmo, but in the void they were nothing but a light show. Now certainly the Titania could withstand sustained fire from several ships at a time, especially against the comparatively primitive Corisian vessels, but she was taking fire from 10 ships at a time, and more were getting within weapons range. Even an advanced system such as hers could not last forever. But as much pain as she was taking, she was dishing it out right back, cannons pounding non-stop, lasers and plasma weapons pulsing, the tips of the weapons glowing red-hot even in the cold vacuum. Missiles were launched almost as soon as they were loaded, and the air within the gunnery stations was growing warmer by the minute, the gun crews sweating in their uniforms. The ship rocked again, the shield failing slightly, and they took their first direct hit. It did little more than scratch the paint, the shields coming back up over the damaged section almost immediately, but everyone knew they would not last much longer. At least they would die in battle, helping those that had needed it. The captain grit his teeth and tapped at his personal console, gathering up all their logs, the data they collected during their mission, and the fight, and formulated a simple message. Reinforcements required. Friendlies in need of assistance. Titania's chances of survival are 0%. Remember us, and make the enemy do the same. With everything compressed and the important stuff marked as urgent, he sent the data packet screaming through the void faster than thought. In less than 5 minutes it was received, and the urgent message read. Calls went forth and QRS were brought online. The Titania would get her reinforcements, even if they would be too late to save her. The trip would take 5 days. 5 days of in-transit preparations and awful waiting. But they would make it, and they would do their job. The captain received a response and looked it over, sighing softly. Message received. Reinforcements inbound. Godspeed, Titania. Your deeds shall be remembered. It was a simple message, but that was a comfort to the captain. He leaned back and watched the battle continue to unfold. Another Corisian ship going down in flames, the reactor detonating in a particularly impressive explosion. I could hear the sounds of battle growing softer and softer, but as my heart filled with hope, the door to the command center was blown off its track, weapons rising immediately, my own included, as a Corisian trooper stepped through, spitting their vile insults. Before any of us could pull the trigger, the trooper was pulled off his feet with a scream, and a sickening crunching sound followed. We all shivered and tightened our grips upon our weapons, just as the machine stepped through the smoke-filled door and sat on its haunches. It just sat there and looked at us, and soon more of its kind appeared, mirroring the first and seemingly conversing in silence, before the leader looked at me and opened its tooth-filled maw. Greetings, gentle being. You will be pleased to know that the building has been secured. Your forces are getting some much-needed relief, and the enemy is being pushed back. Further reinforcements are on the way, ETA 5 days. We shall hold the line. Good day. It spoke, then stood, and with its companions it trotted out of the command center, no doubt off to continue fighting. Many eyes looked at me, in need of some sort of clarification or perhaps just for new orders. My brain took a minute to reset itself, but once it had, I snapped into action. Gather up anyone that can still fight. Prepare counterattack forces. We need to reconnect with any holdouts there might be. Make sure they know about our new friends, I bellow. And the room bursts into a flurry of motion. And somebody fix that door. The Titania's shields went down for the last time. Hundreds of rounds slamming into our hull. Where fire was concentrated seemed to do the trick, but the damage only seemed to make her fight harder than before, as if they hadn't been taking the fight seriously in the first place. But it wouldn't be enough, and soon the guns went silent, the gunnery control systems blown to pieces. The captain was thrown from his chair as an explosion rocked the ship, making it lurch. Pain bloomed on his head, blood dripped onto the floor. With a grunt, he forced himself back into his chair and looked at a status report. It wasn't looking good. Enemy flagship identified, sir, but weapons aren't responding, the tactical officer yelled, cradling an arm against his chest. Engines are still alive. Do we still have helm control? He said, and the helmswoman nodded, spitting a tooth into her palm with a frown. The captain paused, looking them each in the eye. They knew what was about to happen, and they nodded each time his gaze met theirs. Well then, since I can't think of anything profound to say, perhaps today is a good day to die. Prepare for ramming speed. The Titania turned towards the enemy flagship, hull plating starting to peel away as she accelerated to her max speed, and then past it, as he ordered the ship to be pushed past her limits. The Corisian flagship began to turn, but it was too slow, and like a spear the Titania plunged into the flagship, the pointed bow of the hull digging in deep. Though they had shattered the flagship's bridge, the Titania would not settle for merely crippling the ship, and so only after a few seconds it was enveloped in a burning sphere, and thus a new sun flared into existence before fading. The flagship suffered a series of sequential detonations before it was fully destroyed, and the Corisians were left shaken and confused. I do not recall much of what happened next, I am afraid. Everything was a blur. I fear perhaps I have attempted to repress much of it, and I would not be surprised if that was the case. What I do remember is that for 5 days we held the line, saving as many lives as we could. The Corisians tried to root us out, but the angels held the line with us, and they sacrificed much to keep us alive. And then the humans came, and they drove the Corisians away with fire and fury. At last we had won, and though the war did not end that day, it was no longer our fight, or so the humans said. They stepped up, built an impenetrable wall between us and the Corisians, and then went to work, teaching the Corisians the meaning of fear. We learned that even though the humans would prefer to remain isolated, their intense curiosity drove them to explore regardless. And so they had done just that, and it was by sheer luck they had encountered us at all. When I met my first real human, I was surprised by their appearance, but more surprised by the angels they had crafted. I stood beneath the first to fall, narrate, as I would later learn. Human machinists and technicians crowded around the slumped form of the angelic machine, rooting around in the blown open chest cavity. One of them spotted me and trotted over, wiping dirty hands upon their work uniform. "Can I help you, sir?" they asked. The translator's working perfectly now. I was still wary of these humans, but since they had arrived, they'd been nothing but pleasant and open about their intentions. Once the war was over, I knew diplomatic talks would be opened properly, should we emerge victorious, of course. "Yes, I assume this construct is not just a simple machine, but a mech of some kind?" I asked, and the machinist nodded. "That's correct, sir," they said, craning their head back just slightly to look me in the eye. "Then, why aren't you trying to retrieve the pilot?" "We are, sir." That confused me, and I glanced at the mass of humans partially standing inside the chest cavity. "But wouldn't the cockpit be in the head? It seems the most logical place to me for it, no?" I asked, and the human blinked, then shook their head. They looked about to respond when one of the other humans made a sound, and poked their head out of the chest, and yelled for the one talking to me. "Found her. It's not looking good," they said, and presented a small cube no larger than 1x1 tetra. This only confused me further, and I simply had to know what they meant. "I do not understand. That cube does not look large enough to fit a human inside of it. Can you perhaps compress your bodies down to such a small size?" I asked, and the human shook their head sadly. "No, sir, we can't do that. But we can fit in there if we've been digitized. Allow me to explain." And he did. I was shocked to learn that a human had willingly undergone the process of digitization in order to become one with the machine they piloted. It was reversible as well. Most of the time, one of the mechs would get damaged to the point of no repair, and the human inside would be reconstituted into an organic form for pickup, or to keep fighting. And when not in service, the machines stood empty in their racks, while their pilots mingled with their flesh and blood peers. But sometimes the damage was too great, as I would learn was the case with many of the angelic mechs that had come to our rescue. Sometimes the pilots were unrecoverable, dying within their mechs like Lieutenant Kira Hines had while piloting narrate. It was a shame, and her loss would be keenly felt amongst those of her peer group who had survived. In time, the scars of our long war began to fade. Humanity became a steadfast friend and even an honorary member of the Confederacy. They did not retrieve their fallen angels, instead leaving them to watch over us in death. Now the bodies of Nail, Ruhil, Zuriel, Akriel, and Malkadiel are monuments to the sacrifice of a brave few. On our other worlds, the dead there remain as well, captured in their last moments. Ruhil crouched behind his shield, heavy cannon in hand as he held the line, his broken sword buried in the dirt at his side. Zuriel, who had shielded a hospital with their body, saving countless lives with her sacrifice. Akriel, who had fallen from the sky after challenging the Carisian fleets, decimating entire squadrons before being destroyed. Malkadiel, who had stood defiant to the end, screaming their grief and pain at the loss of their family as they lay waste to any Carisian that dared draw too close. And lastly, of course, Nail, who would use her own body to provide cover for those few brave enough to defend her in her last moments. Only one of them had survived, and every year I would join the pilots as they visited their fallen brethren. I too visit them on my own, now and then, looking upon the forms of the dead with a heavy heart. I was gladdened that those amongst my people who did not trust the humans had not found the technology to build such marvelous creations, as the internal hardwares of the angelic machines had liquefied upon death, leaving them as little more than husks surrounding the pilot's black box. Such distrusting fools would have only desecrated the honored dead with their paranoia and greed. I stand now before the monument. Each of our homeworlds has one. It remembers the humans who died for us, each one custom built to reflect the particular warriors who came to our aid, and the scout cruiser Titania as well. I look up at it, seeing the machine standing tall and proud. Those who had fallen held their pilots in their hands, weapons stowed. The one who had lived raised their blade into the air in victory. Around their feet stood the faceless Equello, who had fought beside them, too many to place upon the statue. But around the base were the names of those brave souls, written so small as to barely be legible. But they were there. They were remembered. They will always be remembered. Excerpt from Angels of the Void, The War of Damnation, and Humanity's Intervention.